Thank you all for coming. I'm Simon Maxwell. I used to work here, but I don't anymore. But it's great to be back because it gives me a chance to celebrate work which I saw develop and grow and become, as it always was, but truly world-beating during the time that I was at ODI. And it's wonderful to be able to have both Caroline and Jonathan here to introduce their book, Tourism and Poverty Reduction, Pathways to Prosperity, which you will find on sale outside for the heavily discounted price of £18. And I do urge you to buy it, because if you don't buy it here, it'll be much more expensive if you want to buy it next week somewhere else. And I'm delighted to welcome John de Vial here, who is an industry authority and leader, Director of ABTA, Travel Live, Trustee of the Travel Foundation, somebody with a huge experience in the sector, who will help us, I think, to frame this discussion with its genuine commercial implications. Caroline and Jonathan will introduce the book, but let me just leave you with one small calculation to think about as you listen to them present. I hope you'll hear from them what is the total value of the spend in developing countries of the tourism industry. You'll also hear them, I imagine, say what is the average share of that spend that stays with poor people through various pathways which they'll talk about. And then they'll tell you what the share of the spend could be when best practice is followed. And so the calculation I would like you to think about during their presentation is, what's the total benefit to the poor of the tourism industry today? What could it be if everybody followed best practice? And then what do we have to do to get from where we are today to where we could be if everybody follows best practice? And I think you'll be surprised when you hear the numbers at how big the potential of this industry is to make a real difference to the lives of the poor. There is, of course, lots of stuff in here that is not about numbers, and you'll find that this is a beautifully written and presented book, very easy to read, very nice summary diagrams and charts, characteristic of the writing style of both Caroline and Jonathan. So it's a pleasure to read. I hope you'll read it, but first let's listen to what they have to say. You'll speak for about 20 minutes. John, I think you'll speak for about 10 or 15, and then we'll have an open discussion for as long as we like. Who's going first? Me.
Bit of a yo-yo.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed for everyone who's come, and also we've got a large community online, so welcome to you too to this this public event. We will take part of our speech to make probably a rather clumsy pitch at trying to persuade you to buy the book, but we really wanted to take the opportunity in this presentation to explain the journey that we've been on. Caroline and myself, that led up to the production of the book. And so what we want to convey there really is the reason why we think as we do, not just what we do think. It also, by taking a bit of a retrospective, it allows us to make sense of history, which is always easier with the benefit of hindsight. So if I go on to the first slide. All of us go on holidays, but what is the justification for taking a fascination with tourism into the office and thinking about it at work? We think there's a very strong justification for this, and this map is a tourism nerd's view of the world, and I think explains that reason why we're looking at tourism in developing countries. The size of countries here is represents the number of international arrivals. And so you see some countries are huge, like France, like Spain here and the UK, and some countries are really quite small. You see America here, pretty small. But the important point is that the developing country is strongly represented on this global map. You see the size of typically middle-income developing countries like Mexico, like Thailand here, Malaysia, South Africa. see that very significant numbers of international tourists are going to the south. In fact, 40% of international trips had a destination in a developing country. It's not just the big middle-income developing countries that are benefiting also. We've spent a lot of time over the last 5 years or so in some of the smallest, poorest countries in the world, and these have a tiny flow of tourists, a few hundred a day. And for instance, countries like Tanzania, Gambia, Laos, Ethiopia often have 30% of their exports are comprised of tourist receipts and a very large chunk of the economy. So we think that you can relax. We think that there's a very strong case for doing what we're doing today, which is looking at tourism in developing countries. Caroline's now going to give us a bit of a history lesson.
Thanks, John, and thanks, everyone. I'm going to canter through almost 2 decades of history in a few slides, so we can actually move on to what we think and not just why we think it. Since the 60s, academics in the tourism literature have been discussing the pros and cons of tourism, but for John and I, it started in the early 90s in southern Africa. John was working near Kruger National Park in South Africa. I was working in Namibia with communities in the post-apartheid era, where the post-apartheid emphasis was on transition to equality, away from the gross inequality that was very evident in the white-owned tourism industry. Land reform gave communities assets with which they could suddenly engage in commercial ways with the private sector. And conservation had really been the motor of communities getting involved in tourism, at least from the sort of NGO and donor point of view. But I was there as an economist, and we began to see the agenda shifting from it's not just about conservation, it's about livelihoods. And it's about the economic impact for local, rural, it was at this time, communities. These are some photos from Namibia, some examples of tourism that's developed in the communal areas. So at that time, the focus was the tourism impact on local livelihoods. In 1999, I had joined ODI back here in London. We've all heard of the Millennium Development Goals, whether you're a commercial tourism person or a development fundi. It was about the focus on poverty. 97 new Labour government, very much taken with the focus on the poverty agenda. So ODI worked with IIED, the International Institute of Environment and Development, with Deloitte and Touche, who were commissioned by DFID to do a report. Nice to see Oliver here in the front row. And with Harold Goodwin at ICRT, the International Centre on Responsible Tourism. And we developed this idea of looking at the link between tourism and poverty and coined the phrase pro-poor tourism. People said, you what? But it was about putting tourism on the poverty agenda for these New York summits that were focusing on poverty, and putting poverty on the tourism agenda for tourism people that had talked about maybe sustainability, but not the poverty word. So this was the premise. Tourism could be pro-poor, it could be made more pro-poor, and let's not just talk about community tourism, but any kind of tourism. So now we shifted from livelihoods to poverty reduction. Then in the early 2000s, we were very much focused on the enterprise level. We were working with businesses. Pro-poor tourism pilots in Southern Africa worked with a set of mainstream businesses on how they could develop linkages with the local economy. One of the big case studies, the examples that came out of there, was working with Spear, where the supply chain was transformed to bring in local people, and that gave hard evidence of the transformation, the percentage increase you can get in local incomes from the supply chain. So we started focusing on the supply chain, another piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And at the same time, we were working with the UK mainstream industry as a foundation called the Travel Foundation emerged, which was a private sector, government, non-governmental, tripartite foundation. So the focus was on enterprise, private sector, and supply chains. This is an example of one of the outputs from PPT pilots that we used and evolved over the years, explaining to businesses the different ways in which they can develop linkages with the local economy, from their supply chain to their staffing to their tourist excursions and shopping and so on. 2006, things shifted. And we started looking at the destination as a whole, not just the business. Started off with what we were calling a value chain mapping or enterprise mapping in Luang Prabang in Laos, where we looked not at one enterprise but lots of enterprises, not at one supply chain, but at food, accommodation, excursions, and shopping across the lot, and try to get a picture and actually work out how much of everything the tourists spent reached the poor. First one was really rudimentary, we were learning as we went. But the focus was we assess all the value chains and what the poor earn, and we look at destination level, not just enterprise level. By this time, John and I were both working together. He took over the tourism program here at ODI. I was overseas, and the carbon footprint increased, as you can see. And over the next few years, ODI was involved in studies of this enterprise level mapping in all these different destinations. This gave us a lot more evidence of what was actually reaching poor people in destinations. Our focus at this point was very financial, I will admit. Evidence that was then used much more rigorously to say, okay, this intervention would generate this much benefit for poor people. So what interventions could be recommended, whether to provincial government or donors. And best of all, it started giving us some cross-country comparisons. Oh, in this destination, only 8% of shopping expenditure reaches the poor, whereas in many others it's 15, 20, 25. Why is that? Once you start getting that kind of information, you can really start feeding into some local eye-opening and planning. So then in late 2007, the World Bank said to us, oh, what does the literature say about all the links between tourism and poverty reduction? What do we know? We had very much worked our way, done things in no other way than the way we knew how to do them, to be honest. And this forced us to look outside our own silo and see what other people in other methodologies and other disciplines were saying. We had started off very much enterprise level livelihoods and gone to pro-poor analysis and value chains. But economists using input-output analysis, they've talked all about linkages and with other sectors as well, whether food, transport. Satellite accounts have been desperately great proponents of tourism, but really we had not engaged with them. They were looking at something completely different. Interesting things were happening on computable general equilibrium models. It took me ages even to learn the acronym, let alone understand what they were doing, and find that it was actually really very interesting, where they were looking at the size and some distributional issues where they weren't all doing that. Master planning, we intended to be very critical of, and to some extent still are. And then we had some interesting regression analysis where they compared experience in 1931 countries with tourism. We had to look outside the box and start saying, on this issue, for example, links between tourism and the food sector, what do all these different types of academics, practitioners, economists say, and compare across? So that's what we think we did for the first time, is try and make the links between those. And so 2008, 2009 has been a process of building a jigsaw. All the different pieces that came from that work over the years basically turned into the book that you now have. Or perhaps you don't have, that you can see, sorry. So at that point, I'll hand back to John, who's going to go through what we actually are saying in the book.
Thanks, Caroline. I've got an unenviable task here. I've got 3 slides to describe a book. So this is my first slide, and I thought we'd start with a picture. And this is the picture where, after reading lots and lots of journals and travelling to lots of places, these are the different ways that we think that the tourist sector can affect poor households, both within and outside the destination. We now think, and I hope you come to agree, that actually it's blindingly obvious, that this is unsurprising and is completely straightforward. Several steps in it were a bit of a revelation to us. We started with the red bits, and we think that the direct effects of tourism on poverty are fairly straightforward. If you ask anyone working in the tourist sector, anyone in a destination, people from poor backgrounds work in hotels, they receive money, that's a pro-poor impact. So we weren't surprised by that one, and lots of studies have looked at that. What we learned from a lot of the economics literature, particularly look at these intersectoral linkages, where a dollar spent on tourism has an impact outside the tourist sector. That a lot of the impact, both financially but particularly in terms of pro-poor impacts, are reflected in the green bits. They're the indirect and the induced effects. Indirect because a dollar spent in tourism has an impact outside the tourist sector on construction, on the agricultural sector, on the retail sector. And induced effects where a tourism worker that might not be poor at all then goes and spends money in the local economy, and some of that spending accrues to the poor. The one that really caught us out was the purple bit, the dynamic effects. We have been busily running around hotels, talking with hotel workers, talking with farmers, talking with construction companies, and it hadn't occurred to us that these longer term effects, longer term because they don't happen immediately you open a hotel, but things like the improvement in infrastructure, the improvement in skills, the tax base, the tax take from tourism, on the positive side, and on the negative side, some of the environmental impacts actually account for quite a lot of the impacts of tourism. And we've been running around looking at what we call the short-term impacts, jobs and earnings, and do you buy an apple here or there? And we had missed that. We'd also missed the fact that, again, a dynamic effect, that where tourism works, there's an absolute tsunami of hard currency hitting a country from tourism receipts. And that can have a very bad impact on the rest of the economy. It can result in an overvalued exchange rate, which is a very bad idea if you happen to be a cocoa farmer who's trying to export his crops. So we learnt a lot from constructing this diagram. The important point was that a lot of studies have looked at one of these three pathways, and some have looked at two, but very, very few studies have looked at all those pathways. And if you take one thing from today, you just take that image with you so that when you're doing this kind of work, you're at least aware of what you're not looking at, even if you can't look at it in detail. So that's my first point. My second point is the result of a lot of these air miles and working in hotels of varying qualities was that we did generate a lot of information from across Africa and across Asia, looking at this issue of the share of spending within a destination that accrues to the poor. As I think Simon mentioned, it tends to vary between, at the low end, a bit under 10%, to our best study yet, which was in the Kilimanjaro hiking trail, where it's nearly a third. So for every $3 that a tourist spends on a package holiday there, one third of it accrues to a low-income household. So that's the range.
Can I just clarify, this is in-country spend, isn't it?
It is, yeah. So this does not take account of the costs of getting to Tanzania. And the reason that we didn't look at that was that there's not very much that Tanzania can do about it. And it's only really once the tourist is in the country that policymakers in Tanzania can actually impact on this. And so to answer your question, Simon, about if we move the average, say, from here up to the best practice, if the average across the whole world of the 300 billion pounds accruing to poor countries moves from an average of about a bit under 15% up to, say, 25 or 30%, that's in the region of 45 billion pounds that will accrue to poor people, which is about half of the total spend every year on aid. So it would have a dramatic impact on the incomes of poor people. That, of course, assumes also that aid all accrues to poor people, which would not be the case. So this is important stuff, because if you get it right, and we can demonstrate it's not just in Thailand or rich middle-income countries, if you can get as good as Ethiopia on the cultural circuit, or Luang Prabang, the study that Caroline did in Laos, which is a very poor country in Southeast Asia, if you can get it as good as that, you can have a dramatic impact on the lives of millions of households. So what do we take from this? One thing is that actually quite a lot of the in-country spending does accrue to poor people. If we were looking, for instance, at coffee or a lot of the tropical commodities, there'd be much more at this end of the spectrum rather than anything like that. The second thing is that a lot of what we thought we knew wasn't true. We thought that there was pro-poor types of tourism. Lots of people think that ecotourism, for instance, is very pro-poor, and Tanzania shows here that it can be. But if you look down here, Namibia shows that it isn't always. Business tourism, we had always assumed, was rather un-pro-poor. And in Ghana, it's one of our worst cases there, where only about 7 or 8% of the tourist spend accrues to poor people. But in Vietnam, for instance, it's very good. So this made us believe that actually it's not about the type of tourism, and it's not about where tourists have come from, that's driving this. And the message for policymakers, for industry specialists, is that's a good thing, because wherever your destination is, whether it's packaged beach tourism or it's high-end cultural tourism, you're not going to get away with not having to worry about this stuff, because everywhere that we've been to, we've been able to come up with a package of very practical measures which are commercially viable, which can be implemented, and will very significantly increase the pro-poor impact of tourism. Coming to my third and final key message from the book, this is really the point about what obsesses us in ODI is actually trying to reduce poverty. It's not just studying it and producing some nice graphs saying that it varies in different places. It's actually trying to reduce it. That's our core message. So it's looking on understanding reality in order to make it a better reality. We've developed a robust framework to really be able to identify in the situations where tourism is not transferring benefits to the poor very effectively, how to improve that. Got a 9-step methodology for that, which really focuses on identifying the barriers to the poor, which is preventing them gaining from tourism. Also the barriers to the tourist industry, which is preventing them from being more competitive and allowing the industry to grow. What we tend to come up with is a very broad range of interventions, from absolutely macroeconomic, supporting the enabling environment for business, down to very specific ones. And just a little message down there on the bottom right-hand side, don't forget the indirect links and dynamic impacts, which often have a huge impact on the way that tourism can be used to benefit the poor. Out-of-pocket spending, we found the best agent in the whole value chain for reducing poverty is actually the tourist. If you look at the way tourists spend out-of-pocket expenditure, that always, everywhere we've been, reaches the poor much more effectively than hoteliers spending money, or tour operators spending money, or excursion agents spending money. So even if it's a small part of the value chain, it's an extremely important part of the picture. The role of government. Tourism is, of course, private sector activity, but when you go to a state where the government is not supporting the tourist sector, I'll take as an example Cambodia, which is not tackling corruption in the land market. It is granting exclusivity arrangements for a whole range of private sector airlines and operators, has a dramatic impact on how tourism benefits the poor. because the problem with corruption is that the poor don't benefit from it. It's the elite. Business case for interventions. It's a very important discipline on us, and one that, as we do more work in the private sector, is becoming more and more important, because it's all very well if you're working for a development agency to say, well, we found these problems and the way to solve them is to throw lots of grant money at benefiting the poor. It's not a very difficult argument to make. Much harder when you're faced with a commercial director of a large tour operator and you have to develop a business case for doing this. And we've had to sharpen up our act a lot on exactly that. And just this final point about two different ways of looking at pro-poor tourism. You can look at the share that the poor get and try and increase that. That's a kind of Robin Hood strategy. Poor get more, non-poor get less. And that's really, I think, where we started in the early days. We, in a sense, were implicitly assuming that the function of tourism, the purpose of tourism, was to help poor people, and were surprised when it didn't, and so made a whole range of recommendations about how the poor would benefit more. I think what we came to realise was that very often you've got to look at the two things, increasing the share of the poor and trying to grow the tourist sector itself together. Because particularly where you're in a destination where the tourist sector is working quite effectively to channel benefits to the poor, often the best strategy is actually to grow tourism. That's a way to increase the benefit to local communities. It's not necessarily to change the share. So that's your three slides, which are summarising a lot of the thinking that's some of the thinking that's in the book. Thought I would just end with saying what we're going to do now in ODI. Problem work in a think tank is you've got to keep thinking, really. And one of the things that we find difficult and we're hoping to improve is the difficulty of having looked at all these methods and all these possibilities. How do you deliver it to a funder that doesn't want to pay you for more than 20 or 30 days? That's an absolutely critical issue for us, because we've got to be pragmatic. We've got to know how we can, with justification, cut corners to get a good, reliable product to funders. Because we could say, well, we've done all this research and we need 100 days to answer any of these questions. That would probably be true, but no one would be interested in purchasing that, and it would have no impact on the market. Controversial point, this second one, broadening the exclusive focus on poverty. Pro-poor tourism was very much a creature of its time. It was all about what was happening in Britain in the late 70s with a new Labour government that was reorientating the aid budget to be focused primarily on poverty reduction. What we've noticed is that we're getting increasing pushback from in the destinations. Ethiopians don't like to talk about poverty. Vietnamese people do not like to talk about poverty. They like to talk about local linkages and increasing growth. So we're getting pushback from the beneficiaries. I think it's also true that the focus within the tourist sector in terms of tourist research is changing. And recently I've talked on platforms under the banner of responsible tourism and inclusive tourism, so not pro-poor tourism at all. And I have absolutely no problem with that. We can have a very interesting discussion afterwards about this different terminology if you wish, but I think the aim of it is all the same, and I think it's about creating a coalition of support to achieve what we're trying to do, which is to reduce poverty and empower local communities. An issue which might also come up in the discussion later, stronger focus on the environmental issues. we've very deliberately, so far, focused on socio-economic impact of tourism in destinations. And the reason for that was that no one else was doing it. And so we wanted to plug that market. What we've realised now is that with the concerns with climate change, increasingly we can talk about the benefits, socio-economic benefits of tourism, but the question coming back is, well, what about climate change? How do you compare the environmental damage that inevitably is caused by tourism with the socio-economic benefit? We're about to do some work on that, and there's been some great early research that's been done by the International Institute for Environment and Development, which is talking not about air miles but fair miles, where they're developing an approach to look at that environmental cost and compare it with socio-economic benefit. We're going to do more work with the tourist industry itself. It's important that we understand the industry that we're providing advice to. We can give them the benefit of knowledge on the development sector, but we need to know and really understand the pressures on the industry to come up with solutions which are commercially viable for them. Applying our ideas closer to home. One of the lovely things of doing this job is that lessons that we've learnt in Africa and Southeast Asia, we're beginning to be able to apply in the southern periphery of Europe. And one day my hope is to work in a Scottish Island and apply some of these principles that we've learnt a very long way away to crofters in the Outer Hebrides. Helping others to engage. This is a very big sector now. It's quite a popular and well-funded part of the development of the agenda of a number of development agencies. And there's not very much of us to do it in ODI. There aren't many of us. So what we've been doing recently is quite a lot of training because we want to develop a cadre of other people that can do this stuff and do it well. And finally, dissemination. One of the joys of working in ODI is that you spend a fortnight in a grotty hotel doing a very thorough analysis, come back and write it up and then put it on the web for free. But do use the facilities that we have. This is a think tank, it is a public good. The only reason that we don't publish absolutely everything is if the intellectual property is retained by the funder. But otherwise our presumption is everything goes public. And it's there not just so that you can read it, but so that you can come back to us, can question it. And it's only through that peer review that we're going to get better. And I'm really happy to announce that EarthScan have made the first chapter of the book, which is the introduction, gives you a flavour of the whole thing. It is now available. You can download it at no cost on this website. So I would invite you to do that. So our journey is not over, but this presentation nearly is. Very briefly, I'd just like to thank Caroline, who's been an inspirational colleague, and I think that I moved into the big shoes that she left, and I've really enjoyed your legacy. I think Vincenzo is here tonight. Vincenzo and Jenny, just wave your hand. If you read any elements of this book and it appears coherent and well organised, it's them you should be thanking, not us. I'd like to thank ODI for giving us the space to think. EarthScan, who after the presentation have sponsored a reception, and our fantastic communications team. See Liam there, Smita, and Rob, who work with the facilities. And finally, thank you for giving up an afternoon and coming to talk to us, and I hope give us some challenging questions. Thank you very much.
Very good, thank you very much.